Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream about Q&A about future of science and technology. One of the things that I want to do in this year is to try and do what I can to talk more about how to think about things. I spent a long time trying to do better and better at thinking about things, and I maybe have learned a few things about how to do that. And I wanted to see to what extent I could communicate the methods and approaches that I take to thinking about things to you all. So please don't do ask me questions along the lines of how would you think about such and such a thing, and I'll do my best to sort of talk about the thinking process and try and answer those things. Well, let's see. I see a question here from Mario. What's your view on LLMs with regard to computational irreducibility? Will they hit a computational irreducibility wall anytime soon? Okay, so just to explain, computational irreducibility is a long time idea that I first developed just a bit more than 40 years ago now. It's this notion that just because you know the computational rules by which something operates doesn't mean you immediately know what will happen. You may have to just irreducibly follow those rules step by step to see what happens, to find out what the outcome will be. And there are an awful lot of places when you run computer programs, you don't know what is going to happen. That's why you can't foresee bugs and things like this. There are programs where the only way to know what will happen is to explicitly run it and see what happens. It's the same kind of reason that, for example, math is hard. You can't just jump to the answer. You have to go through the steps of the proof, so to speak, to derive something in mathematics. It's also something which we've learnt is very fundamental to the way that physics works and so on, the interplay between computational irreducibility and our kind of computational boundedness in understanding what's going on, so to speak. So for LLMs, there's the question of, well, what if they are confronted with something which is fundamentally computationally irreducible, some mathematical proof which is necessarily some number of steps long, some prediction about the physical world that necessarily involves following a large number of computational steps. What will the LLMs do? Can they somehow find a way to jump ahead or not? Well, in general, the answer is they cannot find a way to jump ahead. I did some fairly detailed studies of this, but it's also just sort of a fundamental computational idea. You can't kind of reduce what is computationally irreducible. There may be slices of that irreducible process where you can say, oh yes, I notice this particular feature, I can jump ahead and talk about that particular feature, but it won't be something where in general you can kind of jump ahead and see what the answer is. So in general, things like LLMs, the way they're set up is they do a limited amount of computation to get to what they're doing. Now, the kind of the approach that LLMs can use, a bit similar to the way that humans work, is just like we humans kind of think about things, we can go a certain number of steps, but we can't expect to run that program in our heads, so to speak, all those irreducible steps. So instead, what do? We use a tool. I think Wolfram language is kind of the thing that is probably the best developed tool that we can have right now for doing this, for kind of offloading what is computational to something which can efficiently do that computation. It's kind of we built Wolfram language over the last 4 decades or so with an eye to having it be as effective as possible for humans to use, as effective as possible for humans to take kind of things that they can think about computationally about the world and represent them in our language and get computations done with our language. Well, it turns out that AIs are another good user of our technology. And I think the right way to deal with computational irreducibility in LLMs is call Wolfram language as a tool. It's kind of the unique tool that represents the world computationally and lets one kind of do these irreducible computations, which may be hard to do. They may take significant computational effort. But to expect to encode those computations in the operations of a neural net is probably not a very good idea. Now, one of the things that will be interesting to see is the extent to which we can kind of fine-grain the use of computation and Wolfram language in kind of inside the LLM, so to speak, rather than it being, well, I think for a while and then just like we humans do, I think for a while, then I type and I get something to happen in the computational language, then I come back and think about it in my brain. That's the way that LLMs can work right now. That may be the best way to do it. It may be that there's sort of an impedance mismatch between the things which are convenient to have work sort of inside the mind of the LLM and the things that are convenient to work in this kind of computational setting outside. So I think that's it, you should not expect an LLM to just jump ahead to be able to do things which have been computationally irreducible to do. They'll still be computationally irreducible to do. Math will still be hard. The LLMs will be able to do things where it's like, if that's been done before, it's an efficient, LLMs provide you a convenient way to kind of take what's been done before and adapt it to your particular purpose. But they're not going to kind of solve what has been fundamentally unsolvable before. Now, in some cases, LLMs are kind of noticing regularities, pieces of computational reducibility that we didn't notice before. That's one of the fundamental things that seems to have happened with LLMs in language generation, is that they're noticing certain regularities of language that we hadn't really noticed before. And there are questions about the natural world, for example, where are there regularities that we hadn't noticed that LLMs will be able to notice? Are there regularities that are also things that are significant to us? It might be that there's some regularity and it's kind of amusing and it's kind of academically interesting, but it's not something that we can really make use of for anything in technology or something like that. So that's kind of the challenge there. Let's see. I see another question here, sort of related, about from Shashwat. Do you think there's low-hanging fruit in computational psychology? Well, what do we mean by computational psychology? One thing we could mean, which I don't think is what you meant, but one thing you could mean is the psychology of computational systems. When we think about things like LLMs, they're sort of modeled on human thinking and get trained from kind of human output. And there's a question of, if we want to know what is this LLM going to do, do we get some kind of intuitive feeling for what the LLM is going to do? That's something a bit like psychology. It's something where the kind of, and in fact, probably there's an alignment between sort of psychology that we've learnt from humans and psychology that we can apply to the LLMs. And the question really, I think, comes down to, what are sort of the core ideas of psychology? What if we're going to make psychology into something sort of like a science, what kinds of things should we look for that are regularities that we can turn into kind of things where we can think in terms of those regularities? Now, there are kind of small scale features like the things that, I don't know, optical illusions or certain aspects of human reaction times, or the ways that human attention works, these kinds of things. There are things that are, well, let's take things like reaction times and optical illusion, things like that. Those are fairly low-level features of the way that human brains happen to be put together. And some of those kinds of low-level features, there are analogs of those in computational systems, LLMs, and so on. So that's kind of one place where we can expect to have sort of a narrative science. You know, if we say we got a black and white disk and we spin it and we start seeing colors on the black and white disk, something when I was a kid, I tried to figure out how that worked. And I kind of had a hypothesis that I think is not obviously wrong about the different kind of decay times of the different color receptors in the eye that sort of accounts for the color that comes from what would otherwise be a black and white disk spinning around. That's something that is sort of in the hardware, the mechanics of how brains work. When it comes to why is it that people, you know, when they're concentrating on a task and then some weird thing comes from the outside, they don't notice the weird thing coming from the outside. That's probably something that is related to the attention mechanism of humans. To what extent that is sort of turnable into something which is like a quantitative science, I'm not sure. I think that there's a lot that can be got for looking at the analogy between things like LLMs and neural nets in general and what happens in human brains. because I think it's becoming clear that the essential mechanisms are quite similar between neural nets and human brains. There are obviously aspects of human brains about, feed glucose to the nerve cells that aren't the same story as what happens with an artificial neural net. But there seems to be enough kind of architectural and functional similarity between them that I think there'll be a lot of robust conclusions that can be made about sort of how brains work from seeing how neural nets work. And so I would not be at all surprised if there are things you can say about kind of this attention mechanism, which is a term that's also used with a slightly specific technical meaning in neural nets, and what happens in human brains, and to what extent people can be like concentrating on one thing and then they ignore what happens from the outside. I haven't seen particular studies of that in neural nets, but I think you could certainly do that. Now, another question is, can you understand kind of more mechanically what's happening when a certain thought comes to either a human brain or a neural net? And I think that's a thing that's somewhat fraught with difficulty, because I think that the defining what it means to have a thought, defining kind of the notion of sort of developing the coherent, the sort of the nerve firings in a human brain, the activations in an artificial neural net, getting those things into kind of packaging them up to the point where we are thinking about a concept that we can speak about and use a word about. It is, I think, difficult to see I think by the time the word has emerged, yes, you can detect that in both in a neural net and in a brain, probably. But at the point where it's sort of more raw thoughts sort of bouncing around, I think that's going to be hard to have kind of a narrative story that we can readily understand and talk about at the level of these kind of concept-based words and so on. Something I looked at recently in the context of machine learning is this question of sort of what is fundamentally going on in machine learning. And what I kind of concluded is that machine learning is about picking up kind of lumps of irreducible computation and finding ways to harness those lumps of irreducible computation for the particular purposes we want. I mean, the analogy I've been using is you're trying to build a wall. You can build it out of bricks that you've carefully engineered and you can arrange in an understandable way. Or you can build it out of rocks you happen to find lying around on the ground, in which case you're just fitting in the rocks as they can best fit in. And if you ask the question, why are the rocks arranged in this or that particular way, there won't be a good answer to that. And my guess is that a lot of what happens both in machine learning and in neuroscience and the operation of brains is very much that we're harnessing lumps of irreducible computation that happen to fit in some particular way. We happen to find a way to take the particular neurons that we have in the particular patterns of firing and use that to learn how to do arithmetic, let's say. And it isn't, and two different people will do that completely differently. And then there's this question, well, can we find the circuit that represents 2 + 2 = 4? Well, maybe you can find something which is some kind of shadow of that phenomenon going on. But my feeling is that if you say, well, can we find this sort of explanatory narrative circuit, that's sort of a hopeless thing, that's analogous to saying, why is the stone wall the way it is? Now, people do lots of studies with fMRI, with kind of the kind of software analog of that in machine learning systems, making these probes of kind of activations in neural networks. I'm sort of skeptical about how those things really work out. And I think it's a tricky thing. The experiments are hard. You've really got this very sort of noisy, complicated, random system, and you're putting this probe in, and well, if you put the probe in sort of slightly differently, you might get a totally different result. It's a very tricky thing. And, I think to me, the sort of foundational problem of psychology is, what's the question? What are you trying to answer? Are you trying to, for example, characterize, one thing you might try to characterize is sort of the space of human personalities. It's, you might have these very coarse, Myers-Briggs things like this that sort of characterize it. Clearly, people are different. We're all, we all have many detailed differences, but there are broad buckets of people are like, oh, you walk into a room and you're immediately wanting to talk to everybody, versus you walk into the room and you really, you want to be sort of, be shy and be off in a corner type thing. those are different personalities, maybe different in different circumstances of what room you're in and what you're feeling like that day and all those kinds of things. But there is some general sense in which there is a space of different human personalities. And so an example of a question you could ask is, what does that space like? For example, is every possible kind of combination of traits of human personalities, is it realized by actual humans? Or are there kind of buckets of traits that go together that more commonly go together than others? That's the type of thing one might imagine being able to address. Also, if you say, well, this is kind of what the normal human psychology is like, and what is it like when it isn't the normal human psychology? Maybe there are things you can address there. And similarly, for neural nets, you can ask the question, well, this is the normal LLM. What happens if you drug the LLM? What happens if you cut out some piece of the LLM's brain? What happens if you kind of make the LLM somehow by coarse methods, you make it depressed or something? I've done some experiments on this, and it's sort of interesting to see. Particularly, I've done experiments with image generation, where you can kind of modify the mind of the LLM sort of to blow its mind, and it starts producing these bizarre kind of distorted pictures. You could sort of imagine are the mental images of that kind of distorted mind. And I think there are quite possibly the sort of quotes abnormal, non-typical psychology of the neural net as you change these things might have some analogies with the same aspects of that for humans. I have to say, one of the things that LLMs do provide for humans is it's like, well, what's qualitatively going on with this human? You see, all this email, all these social media messages, and it's like, is this human happy? And is this human super frustrated or whatever else? Those are kinds of things that LLMs, following on from more straightforward sentiment analysis and so on, probably can have reasonable things to say about. So as a practical matter, there's probably a lot that can be done to sort of identify kind of psychological states by using LLMs. And that's something that they probably can tease out of kind of the actual output that humans make. Let's see. Let's see. I'm seeing various questions here from Chatty asking, not seeing how intuition is different than LLMs. It's hard to identify what elements create an intuition. Yeah, I mean, I think intuition is about being able to make inferences about how things will work without necessarily verbalizing and formalizing what one is talking about. In other words, I can make a reasonable guess about many kinds of things without necessarily being able to tell you why I think what I think. I might not have a way to verbalize and formalize what I'm doing, but I've kind of seen enough examples that I can extrapolate from those examples. And yes, neural nets in many cases succeed in doing that. When protein folding, for example, it's like it's seen many examples and it can kind of extrapolate roughly how this works. Even in language generation, there's an extent to which that's what's going on, that it's seen many examples and it can kind of extrapolate sort of what you would say in that situation as well. I think, let's see, I'm seeing comment here from Ruliad, nice handle. They've made the LLMs be so nice to keep one engaged. One of my kids was actually commenting that she thinks she's made ChatGPT be nicer to her by being polite to it. I don't think that lasts more than one session. I'm not sure that that's a thing in the eye of the beholder or a thing in the actual system. I mean, it is true that within the sort of context window of the past discussion, you can kind of the way that it responds to you will probably be related to the way that you've responded to it. I think it's an interesting question, to what extent, what kinds of personalities should we give the LLMs to best fit in with what we expect? So for instance, I don't know, when it comes to toys, for example, there's a fair amount that's known, both intuitively and a little bit scientifically, about, if you're going to give a toy to a young kid, emphasize the face and the eyes and things like this. If you're going to, these kinds of the big eyes, people respond, that's a sort of positive emotional kind of connection with the big eyes and so on. There are other kinds of things that lead to a negative emotional connection, those sorts of things. There's a good question about sort of how should the LLMs be set up so that they are most appropriate for us in our interactions with them. I mean, it's the same kind of thing when you're dealing with an intelligent assistant, and it has a certain kind of voice, and it has a voice that you could imagine voices which would be very, very uncanny to one, or very kind of, they give one sort of the wrong feeling about what's going on. It's kind of an extension of the user interface problem of kind of what is it about a user interface that makes it sort of familiar and convenient. I mean, for example, in graphical user interfaces, there was a period of time when sort of fashionable to make these interfaces so-called skeuomorphic, kind of reminiscent of real things in the world. Like, for example, to say, well, it's like I have a desktop and I've got, a leather top to my desk, and so I will have sort of fake leather on my computer screen there, and that somehow that will be more familiar. What became clear maybe a decade ago now is that that wasn't really a very good idea. It was useful to have things that were somehow reminiscent of the world as the world actually is, but that it was much more comfortable and made more sense to people to have things which were not trying to be that literally kind of corresponding to what was seen in the real world, because it really wasn't the real world. It was on a computer screen. And so it has sort of different expectations and a different vernacular for presenting things. Now, to some extent, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because as people get familiar with certain minimalist user interface kind of motifs and so on, then that becomes more familiar and so on. It's kind of like if we see a classical building, classical architecture, there are aspects of that that are probably reminiscent of kind of things in nature that we've become used to, and so it feels comfortable to us. But there are also aspects of classical architecture which are comfortable just because we've seen a lot of that. We know what to expect. And so there's a question for LLMs and so on. What is it that should be the way that LLMs interact that is kind of what we expect? What kind of attitude should the LLMs have towards us that will be comfortable to us, where they're not pretending probably to be actually like humans, but they're sort of taking cues from actual humans, but they're somehow presenting themselves in a way that is comfortable, given that we know they're not actual humans. And I think that's still something somewhat to be worked out. I know at our summer school this last year, somebody studied kind of to what extent you can prompt an LLM to to act like different kinds of personalities. And I don't know to what extent, it's an interesting question, how successful that will be. I mean, how much can you really make it be this kind of corner of personality space or that kind of corner of personality space? How successful will that be? What are the natural personalities for LLMs? Are they rather bland? With kind of the average of the world? Or could the LLMs be extremely eccentric? Would that work? Or would it sort of break down if you tried to make the LLM sort of extremely eccentric? I think those are interesting questions. And, there's an extent in sort of psychology where one imagines, well, you do a questionnaire and you can kind of say, well, how do you fit in personality space based on that questionnaire? And that's obviously something one can do. Somebody tried doing that at our summer school for LLMs. Let's see. Okay, let's see. Left is commenting, it feels real when talking to advanced voices until it becomes repetitive. And at that point, I feel inclined to program it to act more realistic. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. To what extent for us, for example, in many kinds of settings, perfect repetition in, say, a visual scene can be both sort of what you expect and not quite right. It's kind of like if things are too perfect, they don't read quite right to us sometimes. Sometimes they read better to us as being sort of perfect like that. I think it's an interesting question. What's the degree of imperfection that feels natural to us for different kinds of modalities? Let's see, Chatty comments that they prefer the skeptical collaborator LLM personality. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know what, I mean, it's sort of in a sense, it's the fundamental problem of customer service at some level, is what personality should you adopt, given that you have customers showing up, you don't know anything about the customers, what personality should you adopt so that you are sort of the best reasonable fit for all of those different kinds of people who show up. And obviously there are many automated systems that have had to try to solve this problem. And one generally, a certain degree of blandness seems to be fairly typical in those systems, and that seems to be unthreatening to people, and yet sort of feels roughly right. I don't know if that's where sort of things should land in the LLMs, whether in fact we want our LLMs to be bland, whether we want, if we had an LLM that was continually telling us jokes and so on, and being eccentric, would we like that? I have to say, my guess is that for many purposes, we'll prefer the bland LLMs. I'll give you an analogy. In writing things like computer documentation, there's this question of, is it a good idea to be whimsical, to tell jokes in computer documentation? I have to say, when I first started writing these things, I don't know what it is, 45 years ago now, there was a period of time when people regularly were like, oh, it's so cool to have this computer manual that has jokes in it. Well, it's cool up to a point. The first time you look at it, it's like, yeah, you kind of crack a smile. It's kind of fun. The fifth time you're trying to understand something from that piece of computer documentation and it's telling you a joke, you kind of want to throw the book across the room type thing. It's very frustrating. It's better for it to just be straight shot, don't try to be funny, don't try to talk down to somebody, don't try to be whimsical, just keep it straight. Because in the end, it's a utilitarian purpose that you want that documentation for. And I think there are many LLM purposes that are the same kind of story. It'll be an interesting question in the AI tutor that we've been building. That has a kind of a reasonably bland personality, I think. I don't quite know how to measure it, but that's an interesting question, whether that's the right thing or whether sort of it'll get more engagement with kids or something, people of different age groups and so on. If it is more out there, I'm not sure. Interesting thing to study. Let's see. There's a question here from left. Would creating consciousness in a machine and then conducting mind experiments on it be immoral? I feel like it's an autonomous entity at that point. Oh, that's such a can of worms. I mean, there are so many different kind of gradations of that question. I mean, morality and ethics is kind of a human to human type question. I don't think, we extend ethics perhaps to animals, maybe even to nature sometimes. And it's a complicated story because one thing is to extend in a way where you say we have an ethical obligation or something to a thing because that thing is connected back to humans. It's like you've created this amazing bot and you decide one day, it's okay, we can just kill the bot. But then you realize there are 1,000 people that were great friends with that bot. And so killing the bot is not merely a question of the internal feelings of the bot, it's a question of all those people that were entrained with the bot. And so I think that sort of what might be the ethics of a thing becomes actually the ethics of people about people as well. And so it's, that's one way in which things are entrained. If the bot is merely acting for itself and it doesn't, it has, let's say it hasn't even interacted with any people. It's just a bot in a box, and it's just doing its thing, and it's thinking thoughts that we think are aligned with human thoughts. What then is our obligation to it? It's a different thing if the thing has thought those thoughts and then been interacting with lots of humans who will be all upset if that bot is killed. But if the bot is off by itself, thinking its thoughts privately, so to speak, then what is our obligation to it? We think about people that just because somebody is, isn't interacting with people much, we don't think, in typical ethics, we don't think it's any more okay to, bump off that person than it would be if it was a person who was interacting with many other people. I don't think we make that ethical distinction typically. We just think it's a person, and somehow we extend from our own internal feelings about what we would like to have happen to us and so on. We feel that it's appropriate to extend that to anything else that kind of seems like a human and perhaps is a human. And I think when we know it's a human, we kind of have that immediate conversion of our inner feelings about ourselves to our feelings about that other entity. When we know that the thing is merely a bot, it's unclear. And it gets even messier if the bot has the mind of the collective of all of society. That's one thing. If it is a bot that is the repository of I don't know, the training of one particular person, like I know I've left maybe 50 million words of yakking that I've done out there. You can train, I think, a pretty good bot of me from that. And is that any different than having a bot that's trained on the average mass of material left by humanity, so to speak? I think in this question of if we can trace the way that the bot acts, and it's similar to the way a human acts, does that affect our ethics with respect to what we do with the bot? I'm not sure. I think it depends. In the end, I think ethics is partly a story of how people feel about what one is doing. And I'm not sure how people will feel about that. Again, as soon as people have developed a relationship with that disembodied bot, it's a different story. There's a different entanglement with sort of human ethics than there is if it's merely a bot in a box, isolated, so to speak. There are a lot of different cases of this that I think are really hard to disentangle and are going to be important things for the future to try and figure out how this should work. I mean, to give you examples of such cases, what are the ethics of a brain implant in a human that has certain, can one, if there is a brain implant in a human, is it any more acceptable to erase that brain implant than it would be to zap the brain tissue of that human? That's one side. Another thing, you make a brain organoid where it's a bunch of human nerve cells that, and you start seeing activity in that organoid. Is that more unsavory to do something to kill it off, for example, than it is to take a piece of digital circuitry that maybe even is acting more human-like than this organoid is succeeding in acting? Is there something about the biological nature of that organoid with actual nerve cells that makes it seem more morally inappropriate to kill it than it does to erase the memory of this digital version of the same kind of thing? I'm not sure. I think that to some extent, to know how we feel about these things, we have to see them actually seep into society and see what the consequences are and how we end up feeling about it. I'm not sure that some of these things are readily predictable without feeling what happens and seeing what happens in society. I mean, it's perhaps an example of my favorite computational irreducibility phenomenon that, to know what the one's impression is going to be, one actually has to see it happen, so to speak. And one can have theories about these things. I mean, I'm trying to think there are probably things for which people had, there are lots of things about, for example, the extent to which you can there was a time when people said nobody will ever conduct business on the telephone. The only way you can actually, have a real discussion with somebody is in person. Or there were, people have had all kinds of views about how things would feel when technology developed to a certain point and so on. And sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. I mean, sometimes people say, I just can't imagine how society could adapt to that phenomenon, to the, sort of instant communication of things, to transparency of various kinds. I can't imagine how that would work and how that would feel. And yet, in the end, people adapt. And it's also sort of interesting if you look even around the world at very different kinds of social conventions that people looked at from outside those social conventions. It's like, oh my gosh, how can one possibly go for this? That seems totally horrifying. I couldn't live with that type thing. But when you're inside it, it's kind of like, and perhaps when you've grown up with it, it's like, oh yeah, that's just how it works. Something else seems weird. I mean, for myself, I grew up in England, and England, at least when I grew up there, is a place where people don't tend to talk quite as directly as they do in the US. And so, it was much in the US, I think perhaps because it's a country, perhaps in many ways a more heterogeneous country, or at least has been, it's people have a habit of just saying what they mean because the innuendo of, oh, everybody knows that when you say this, you mean something different. Actually, it isn't the case that everybody knows because there are enough differences in people's sort of backgrounds that they just wouldn't know. It just wouldn't be a proper communication. And there are things like that where you can say, well, I can't imagine that people would just say things directly. It just seems so rude and so on. But then, when it happens, it works out just fine. And so, I think it's hard to predict some of these things which become technically possible. And then the question is, well, how do people feel about it? When we have, right now, we're not quite at the point where sort of the digital twins of us are really, we really start to have, oh yeah, my bot over here is doing all these things for me. My bot is my friend type thing. I don't quite think we're at that point yet. We probably will be at some point. And then people's feelings about that. For example, it could be the case that I might have 5 bots for myself. I might not have just my one bot that is my one kind of assistant. I might have my bot for when I need to be entertained, my bot when I'm really trying to concentrate and work hard, and they'd have slightly different personalities. And that might be just like I have different friends with different personalities, and I might at some point be really, really into the bot with this particular personality, and then later a different one, and so on. I don't think we know what we will feel our sort of obligation to these things. And if we say, it's like, you might say, well, you might say you have a car, and I tend to keep my cars for a decade or so. It's like you might get very attached to your car. I don't get particularly attached to my car. It's just like when I need to buy a new car, I buy a new car. And there's no kind of emotional connection to that. I don't know whether for the bot of me or something that is my assistant bot, whether I'll feel more of a connection or whether it'll just be like, oh yeah, I need a new one of those, and get a new one, and it's all nothing is it's not an emotional moment, so to speak. Let's see. Gosh, lots of questions here. Okay. Natanan is commenting, as AI becomes a dominant tool for information dissemination, how do we ensure that it supports critical thinking rather than passive consumption? It's a good question. I mean, there is a certain, I would say, certain people in certain cultural environments say, I want to figure out new things. Other people in other cultural environments are just like, I've got to do what's conventional. And the fact is that as we see sort of the responses of the LLMs to things, there is a great degree of conventionality to those responses. It's kind of like, I was trained from the mass of everything that's on the web. I'm going to respond according to sort of the average of what the humans out there say. That's kind of a reversion to the mean. Everything becomes banal, bland, whatever else. I think that's a risk. And I think it starts to look, as that becomes more common, it starts to look more extreme when you go away from that. I think there are other examples of that in lots of domains where kind of it's kind of the usual and customary way of doing things. As things have gotten bigger, it's kind of become, oh yes, that's just the way it works. Something like, different ideas about education. It's just like it's all done this way because that's the usual and customary way to do it. Or certain kinds of sort of professional interactions and so on. But with humans, it's kind of like that's the conventional thing. And anything other than that is kind of shocking in some way. And as more and more becomes conventional, the deviations become more and more shocking. One thing about growing up in England, at least when I was growing up there, I don't know, now half a century or so ago, there were a lot of eccentrics, and eccentrics were kind of people kind of liked eccentrics. The people who were off doing strange things and dressing in strange ways, acting in strange ways, and so on. There was a certain degree in having strange hobbies and whatever else. There was a certain degree of respect for the eccentric. I think in some other cultures, there isn't so much respect for that. There's, for example, in British culture at the time, like, oh, I made a lot of money. It's like people are like, oh, okay. It wasn't, that wasn't a revered kind of trait. Unlike in American culture, at least at many periods of history, where that's like, there must be something good about this person. They were very successful, so to speak, and financially and such like. So I think but this question about whether eccentricity can survive in a world where sort of there is much that is banal and everybody expects, when you write a letter, nobody expects the letter to be unusual. They expect the letter to be usual and customary. It's I don't know. I think that is a risk at this time, that as you see more LLM written letters and so on, that it's just like, well, they're all the same, and that's kind of just what you expect. And anything different, it might be good or it might be bad. And I think it's a cultural question whether people view it as being good to be different or bad to be different. And I think that's a thing that is more in sort of the fabric of society than it is necessarily in the technology of what's going on. And I think in this question of whether people will choose to think for themselves, I mean, there have been long periods of history where people haven't thought that that new thoughts were really possible. I mean, that was the Renaissance back in whatever 1500s, whatever it was. That was yes, there can be new thoughts, so to speak. We're not just following the thoughts laid down by the ancients. And it is a question whether new thoughts are something which will always be a thing that people value. It has been true of the last few centuries that, and particularly since the Industrial Revolution, that the notion of progress, the notion that things change over time, the future is going to be different, that's a fairly new notion. For many periods of history, the future wasn't expected to be different. The future was expected to be more and more generations of the same. This is a modern concept that the future is going to be different. And I think that insofar as we have the idea that the future is going to be different, that is something of a driver to pay attention to the new, the different, the perhaps eccentric. But insofar as we say, hey, we're good here, we'll just take the standard and customary kinds of things, and we'll sort of flatten out that notion of progress, then there is a risk that it's just like, hey, it's fine as it is. We don't need to change anything. I think it's a feature of countries, among other things, that there are periods of their history where they kind of are like, hey, everything's okay here. Let's just keep it as it was. And there are other periods when countries are sort of, where they're coming out of some situation where the country really was economically in terrible shape or whatever else. And it's like, we're growing, we're building from here. And those have a somewhat different character to them. And I don't know, for the world at large, there's a certain, there have been periods, I think, when people have felt everything's kind of okay, and there are things we don't like, and we got to improve this and that. But it's kind of, and there are other periods where it's like we got to make progress, we've got to change things. And I think that's sort of perhaps the overarching phenomenon above and beyond the particulars. But it certainly doesn't. I will admit that I'm a little concerned that sort of we'll get to a point where every letter, every paper, it's kind of written by LLMs, it's processed by LLMs, it's kind of banal in the same way. And that will be unfortunate. And whether the reaction will be whenever you see something that isn't like that, it's like, wow, that's great. I'm excited. That's exciting music rather than kind of bland muzak, so to speak. Or whether it's like, oh, that's different, help. The world, we don't want that. We just want same, so to speak. I think it's more societal perhaps than purely technological. Um, let's see. Natra is commenting, what role should education play in preparing individuals to critically engage with AI-generated content? Well, I sort of believe in thinking as being something worth doing and just sort of going with the flow and not really thinking and not sort of critically examining what's going on. I like the critically examining what's going on. It's kind of been something that I sort of find fulfilling, and I try to do a lot myself. I happen to think it's somewhat useful for the world, but mostly I do it because it's something I like to do. And I think that sort of the thinking, sort of learning to think is an important thing. Unfortunately, education, as it has become more and more industrialized, is less and less about learning to think. It's more and more about learning to mechanically do, learning to solve that math problem by this template that you can learn to solve that math problem. Learn to do this thing by a process, not by, hey, let's just start from scratch and just figure it out and think about it. I think it's more difficult probably to teach thinking than it is to teach mechanism. But I think it's super worthwhile if one could do it. And in my own efforts, I've tried to do that. I've tried to kind of get to the point where it's like, to some extent, you can teach thinking by showing thinking. And I think often in educational settings, teachers don't really want to show thinking. They want to show just, here's the facts, this is what you learned type thing. Here's the process, this is what you learned. Rather than, I, the teacher, I'm going to try and think about something in front of you, so to speak, so you can model that and learn how to think about things. I think it's a much scarier thing to do at some level, to think in public. I mean, I do that a lot, as I do that in these live streams all the time. It's I have no you guys ask these questions and I try and figure out useful answers to them. And that for me is, I like doing that partly because it is an exercise in thinking, sometimes in thinking in directions very different from ones I've thought about before. But it's something which it's I think, a really important thing to teach. It's not so easy to teach. Can we have the AIs help teach it? I don't know. We're doing our first experiments now with the algebra tutor that we'll hopefully have online fairly soon. That's doing a fairly specific area that happens to be quite an important sort of gateway for people in the educational process as it's set up today. So I think it will be useful, but it's something where it'll be interesting to see whether it's possible to have an AI teach thinking, even perhaps in a way that humans cannot. AIs have the nice feature that they're very patient, and they can kind of roll with the punches of lots of kinds of things that a student might do. Let's see. Does the use of bots and LLMs in sensitive areas like education, healthcare, and governance risk dehumanizing these vital sectors? It's an interesting question. I mean, I kind of think that there is a certain sense in which the mechanics of things, in a sense, can and should perhaps be dehumanized, in the sense that there becomes a point where it's just, oh, that mechanically happens. And it's kind of, you might say, oh, I don't know, in some medical area, it's like, well, you can have somebody poke and prod and somebody, or you can just do an MRI. And the MRI is, in a sense, dehumanized relative to the poking and prodding, but it's something that is you don't have to think about it, so to speak. And I think that my feeling would be in a lot of these areas that there's more that you can do kind of easily without thinking about it, that is automated. And in a sense, the human is out of that loop. And then that gives one the opportunity potentially to have more human engagement in places where that human engagement really makes sense. I mean, it's kind of like in the education case. Is it the case that the human engagement might be about the sort of psychology of encouragement, whereas the mechanics of how do I learn to do algebra might be more the thing that is delegated to the machine? And it could be that the more you can take time on the psychology of encouragement, and which you can take that time because you're not having to spend time saying, yes, when you add fractions, you do this and that and the other, because that's been done by the machine, so to speak, that actually one comes out ahead in terms of the kind of real human engagement, as opposed to just the human engagement that's just repeating the line from the textbook over and over again. Let's see. Yuzi is asking, are LLMs changing how people do physics, especially in frontier areas, like coming up with unified theories? That's a good question. I've been thinking about that question. I've been, let me make a sort of personal comment about this. I've spent a lot of time doing science, doing computer experiments, and developing intuition about the way the world works from those computer experiments. It's something where from a computer, I get intuition. And a question that I have is, from LLMs, can I get intuition? I don't yet know. I realized fairly recently in the sort of my own personal history, I was doing physics, particle physics and so on, back in the 1970s, and I started using computers to do kind of algebraic calculations back in those days. And one of the things that I realized only very recently was an important kind of cognitive step for me was realizing that when you do these algebraic calculations, you eventually get some feeling for these algebraic expressions. It gives you an intuition about algebra. And that was a place where I was using the computer to get intuition. So when I came to study kind of simple programs and sort of do computational experiments, particularly there, I was using visualization of these computational processes as a way to get intuition about how things work in the computational universe. I think that's been super successful for me. Our current sort of physics project is born out of decades of doing computer experiments and getting an intuitive feeling for what's possible in the computational world. And when I see people who say, "Oh, I'm trying to understand sort of physics and this and that and the other," and they've never done any of these computer experiments, I know they don't have that intuition. And they're always trying to say, "Well, can we engineer this experiment to do this or that thing?" It doesn't work that way. After you do these computer experiments for a while, you develop a certain degree of humility because you never can predict what they'll do. Even after all these years, all the time, I'm still surprised by what actually happens when you actually do the computer experiment. So a question that I've been curious about is, with LLMs, what is the thing that will help my intuition? At some level, I can use LLMs to do things like sort of give me something that isn't just search the literature, but it's a more detailed thing, well, or more coarse-grained things in some ways, that is sort of, I've got this general idea. How does that match with what people have said in the past in this general area? That's not something where you can search for keywords, but it's something where an LLM can potentially tell you, this is where that general idea has showed up before. And I've tried to do some of that. I was trying to do some of that very recently in looking at, well, a slightly different question, which is whether automated theorem proving can also be a source for intuition. But there, what happens is you end up generating these theorems, these lemmas, and they're, some abstract thing, A dot, B dot, A dot, whatever equals whatever. And so I started asking LLMs, hey, have you seen a formula like that before? I couldn't do that with a text search because every time the formula is presented, it's going to look different. I have to say the LLMs have been uninspiring, unimpressive. They're somewhat useful, but not definitely, they didn't blow my socks off in terms of being able to say, yes, in this particular corner of the mathematical literature that you don't know about, there's a thing that's just like this. That hasn't happened yet. Maybe it will happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Let's see. There's question and comment from Francis here. Instead of risking massive amounts of capital on projects that might fail, can we use LLMs to scope out the interesting pockets of reducibility so that greater percentages of our investments succeed? Yeah, that's a long-running hope that there is a machine essentially for making inventions. It's something that people invent that idea with some regularity. I think it's sort of a doomed idea. It's kind of like saying, can one sort of invent creativity? By definition, the creativity is going in directions that haven't been gone in before. Can you get it to the point where you are creating something that is within some template, but sort of original and randomized in some way? Absolutely. And that's something that can be quite useful. Back in 2007 and so when we made our Wolfram Tones algorithmic music generation system, that's a thing where it has a structure, but it has a certain degree of randomness. And yes, within that framework, it's useful for generating things. But when you say, let's try to invent and let's find that place where the invention is going to be most fruitful, my intuition is that that's sort of a doomed idea. Now, can I prove that? Not really. Is it the case that LLMs have found regularity that we didn't know was there? Yes, they have. And perhaps that's I might not entirely agree with myself here. Because I have an example where LLMs have showed us, for instance, that language has more structure than we expected. That's caused me to go off and do a technology project that I've been thinking about doing for a while anyway, but it kind of was an impetus to, yes, LLM, you found this piece of regularity. Now I have much more confidence that this idea that I've had for a long time could actually work. Let me go pursue it. So that's a sense in which the LLMs have kind of shown me a regularity that I can then pursue. And maybe the same is true with, I don't know, protein folding or something. Maybe the LLMs are noticing certain regularities that have always been there, but which we didn't quite have the right, we didn't quite key into. And now the LLMs have noticed those things, and perhaps we can use those in a sort of more engineering, more kind of explicit, rational way, so to speak, to do things. The idea of sort of inventing a machine for inventing things, was a Soviet era idea. It's called TRIZ, which was a kind of a scheme for inventing things, which would have kind of, they had this kind of whole rubric of these different kinds of things. Oh, if there's a sort of A acts on B, where A and B might be, kind of lubricant acting on metal cogs or something, and B acts on C. I don't know, I'm not making a good sequence here, but then there'll be some invention that is A acting directly on C. These kind of patterns, they had several tens, I think, of these kinds of patterns of, if you have this and this and this, there's a gap, and then you can have this. I don't know. I'm not sure if that really works. I think one of the things that perhaps sort of works in that sense, in things, I don't know, I've been involved in scientifically and so on, the sort of analogy of, oh, there's this relates to this in this way. Let's transfer that to this other domain where this will relate to that. I mean, in fact, I think quite a lot of intuition that I have, for example, comes from, oh, I know it works this way in physics. So if I'm thinking about biology, there may be some analogy, even though the ways of thinking in physics and the ways of thinking in biology are quite different. Let's see. Questions here about, it's a question from Francis about NOAA using cellular automata to simulate weather patterns. I don't know about that. One of the things that happens, it's both good and bad. I've invented a fair number of things in my life, both technological and scientific things, and you put them out in the world, and you don't necessarily know what happens with them. In fact, most of the time you have no idea. Most of the time, if I look at Wolfram Language and Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha and so on, you put those out in the world. Millions of people use them. They use them for all kinds of purposes. It's a rare case where I know what they did with them. And sometimes, 20 years later, somebody will say, because I happen to run into them somewhere, oh, by the way, I wanted to let you know that this or that major technological thing was originally done with your technology. It's like, okay, that's nice. It's cool. I like to hear that. But you don't know that. There's no feedback mechanism. It's not like when you put out sort of a consumer product, as Wolfram Language is, it's just like it goes out in the world and people do all kinds of things with it. I mean, I would say for myself, when I use different kinds of computers or whatever else to do things that I think are really perhaps cool, there's not necessarily there's no feedback usually to sort of, oh, this is what happened. In academia, there is something of a convention of sort of cite your sources. I would say that when it comes to citing sort of computational sources, people have been pretty lackluster at that. I mean, if you look at, people who use Wolfram Language and they use it to write a paper, there are some fields in which method sections will always say, oh, we use Wolfram Language to do this. There are other fields where it's just like, well, I worked out this complicated thing. I made this elaborate visualization, and it's just, that's my thing. And you don't really say, well, where it came from. What I have done and things I've written the last many years is that I always have sort of click to copy code. So you see that picture, you click it, and you get Wolfram Language code that you can then run to get that picture. It's a very nice way of having sort of fully reproducible and buildable upon science, so to speak. But in terms of scientific ideas, that's even less clear. When they go out into the world, sometimes there are academic citation types of things. Although I think people tend to be, when it comes to foundational ideas, people tend to be pretty lackluster about that. It's my own approach, by the way. I've not been bought into the kind of traditional academic paper structure. Last time I wrote a sort of traditional academic paper was 1986. But what I do believe in is understanding and describing the history of the ideas one's dealing with, which is, I think, both more useful both to oneself in doing the work and to other people in understanding what's going on than the mere reference 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that you perhaps didn't even look at and you kind of got from some sort of vat of references somewhere. To me, kind of really explaining the history, it takes more work, but it's much more useful. It's also useful for oneself as one tries to kind of understand how what one's talking about relates to what people have thought about before. If one is going in a different direction than's been gone before, is one convinced one's right and they're wrong? Or, they missed it because it was a different time and they were looking at things in a different way, and so on. So this is to say, there are lots of uses of ideas like cellular automata where I have no idea what's been done. And it's very interesting as a kind of, you put things out in the world and it's wonderful that lots of things get done with them. And in a sense, it will be overwhelming in many cases if one got feedback from every single thing that was done. But it's also a funny thing because I don't know. It's always been sort of challenging. To what extent should one stick one's nose into those things and say, wait a minute, I know about that foundational method. I can help with this or that or the other thing. And to what extent do you just let the flowers bloom without kind of micromanaging them, so to speak? And I've tended to adopt that point of view of just put things out into the world. You provide these kind of upstream tools, whether they're tools at the level of technology or tools at the level of scientific ideas, and then just let them live in the world, so to speak. I will say that there's sort of ironies that happen because they're things that I've thought about where I've realized that years later that people have done things sort of the way that I was thinking about them, but and I had kind of missed those ways of doing it. And they then came back and did it even in simpler ways than I had imagined with exactly tools that I'd built. Let's see. Let's see. Weasel is asking, the way you ask LLMs questions is an art. Asking it the same thing using different words has brought back interesting results. Yes, nobody knows why, really. And that's kind of the psychology. I mean, that will be a field, is people who are sort of whisperers, wranglers, psychologists of LLMs, getting a feeling for just how do you talk to the LLM, snake charming, to get the thing to do what you want. I mean, within our company, as we built out some LLM-based products, for example, our recent notebook assistant took a long time to develop, partly because we were developing the sort of tooling around and the wrangling around dealing with LLMs and getting them to do what we want them to do. It's really, it has a certain character of wild animal training, so to speak. You've got this wild animal, it's very powerful, but can you actually get it to do what you want? And again, it's something where I think people, just as people develop a sort of empathetic approach to doing things in sort of human psychology, I would expect that the same thing has happened and will happen with LLMs. It's kind of who gets to have the empathy with LLMs so that you can kind of whisper it, wrangle it, so to speak, to do what you want. It's an interesting thing for the future. Lolly is asking, it's an interesting question to know if the conceptualization of concepts by LLMs is limited by language. Scientists say LLMs create an intermediate conceptualization. Well, my feeling is in our brains, there are lots of neuron firings going on. We're thinking about all kinds of things. The way that we can package those things so that we can remember them for the future and so that we can communicate them to other people is through language. There is a thing there, pre-linguistically, so to speak. But if we want to, when we are thinking about things differently, when we remember 5 years later, what did we think about? We need some robust representation of those thoughts. Or when we're saying them to somebody else, we need a robust representation of those thoughts that will match in their brain as it matched in our brain, so to speak. And language is our primary transport medium for ideas, for concepts. So the notion that there are sort of robust concepts that are not linguistic, that are robust, but we don't have existing language for, yes, we can expect that that will be the case. I don't know how robust. That's an interesting question. I've studied that a bit. To what extent are there things where, for example, with human language, we've got 50,000 words in typical languages. If we said, okay, we're going to have 1,000,000 words, and we got an AI that can deal with having 1,000,000 words, and we've got all those extra words, those 950,000 words, and what do we do with all of those? And is there a robust way of having those extra words that we can kind of transfer to other things? I've looked at this very recently, actually, in terms of mathematics. When you do automated theorem proving, you're generating all these elaborate proofs, which are very hard to understand. But are there kind of waypoints in those proofs that you can sort of pick up and say, hey, this is the thing I can apply elsewhere? And that's kind of an analogy to this idea of are there words that we should have had? Like, for example, is there a word, we have a word for, I don't know, a rectangle, let's say. Should there be a word for a rectangle with a hole on one side and a rounded piece on the other side? Maybe that's a useful word to have. I'll give you an example of this. In logic, for example, we have words for and or and not, standard words. In English, we don't really have a word for exclusive or. It's this or that, but not both. It could be raining or it could be sunny, but it can't be both sunny and raining. And that's a different form of or than it's like, I don't know, I pick up a ball or I pick up a glove. I could have both picked up at the same time, so to speak. Maybe depending on how many arms you have, you can pick up a different number of things. But That's a distinction. Some languages, like Latin, kind of has a distinction of exclusive or from ordinary inclusive or. English doesn't really have that distinction of either or, but not both. And there are other logical constructs like NAND, for example, not and, which is the foundational logical construct for computers. The circuitry of computers is based on either NAND or NOR. But that is not something which it seems like any human language has a single word for. It's something where in a sense, the computers, or at least the designers of computers, the hardware of computers, absolutely, they know what NAND is. But in human language, we don't talk in terms of NANDs. It's sort of a fun thing to try and imagine, having an everyday conversation where the primitive you use is not and or, but it's NAND. It's a bit messy. It's a bit difficult to wrap one's brain around. Don't really know why. But that's an example of a thing where you can sort of extend what you're thinking about by introducing that new concept. And it's a common, well, there's sort of ideas like if you have an artificial language that has sort of more and more and more concepts thrown into it, and you learn to talk in terms of that language, can you then extend your thinking? Now, to some extent, we know that the answer is yes, because when we have jargon, whether it's mathematical, medical, computational, whatever, by using that jargon, we get to have more that we can talk about and readily think about. I mean, sort of my life work of building our computational language, Wolfram language, is about sort of trying to capture these kind of computational concepts in a way that people can learn them and build more thoughts on top of those computational concepts. That's kind of so in that sense, the more words, the more sort of thoughts you can package up into words, functions, concepts, whatever, the more you can build that tower and the more you can successfully think about. And the extent to which it's down kind of at the level of individual neuron firings, not sort of collected into this robust kind of concept or word, there's only a limited distance you can go in that way. Let's see, maybe one more question and then we should wrap up for today. Yes, comments. Assuming merging humans with digital AI is possible, what do you think will be the effects in terms of observing reality? That's an interesting question. I mean, our experience of the world is very based on our particular senses, sight, sound, whatever. A lot of scientific progress has come from having instruments that extend our direct senses, telescopes, microscopes, electronic amplifiers, spectroscopes, and so on. As we extend our domain of sensory, our sensory domain, we end up learning new science, whether it's astronomy, whether it's biology with microscopes, etc. And I think there's sort of a question of whether the things are directly connected to our brains or whether they're just on our computer screens, sort of having more sensory input, about a wider domain of sensory input, what consequences does that have for kind of our what we think of as reality and what kinds of things we can talk in terms of? Yeah, my guess is that many of those things really extend, will change the types of things we talk about. I mean, even if I had sort of augmented reality glasses that showed me things in the infrared, I could see how hot things were, or showed me kind of hyperspectral imaging where I could say immediately, that's a particular kind of chocolate or something with this fat content in it, because I can see that with hyperspectral imaging. That would probably allow me to have a conversation that is bizarrely different from a conversation that I can have today when I'm stuck talking about things that I can see and you can see, so to speak. So I do think that sort of different kind of modalities of measurement and observation have that effect. Now, when it comes to, so perhaps the question is, if you're listening to some sort of, it's like a whole speech, whatever, and you've got this AI there that's telling you, oh, this is the sentiment of what's going on, or this is the, it's giving sort of metadata about what's happening. How does that affect you? I mean, for example, if you could say you're listening to somebody talking about this and that and the other, and at this point, your little, convinceometer says, actually, that's very unconvincing. The person doesn't know what they're talking about. And you see the little display that says, that's a moment where the person doesn't know what they're talking about. That will give you surely a different complexion of hearing the thing than if you just heard it straight. I mean, it's sort of reminiscent of the fact that the more if you're looking at paintings and you know a certain amount about art history and so on, you kind of have some knowledge of the backstory, you have some kind of way of thinking about it, you have a different way of absorbing what you are directly seeing from the painting than you do without that. And so my guess is that these things where you're sort of using AI as sort of a filter on what you're seeing, and it's kind of giving you a metadata track that's telling you things about the things you're seeing, I suspect that will affect what the types of ways one could talk about things and so on. I mean, I think, there's a lot where you might say, there's nothing to see there. We don't, it's invisible. I mean, like, for example, I don't know, we don't visualize the currents of air currents. We don't, unless there's a cloud or something where we can see the sort of fluffy pieces being pulled in this or that direction. Most of the time, in the room I'm sitting in right now, I have no idea what the flow of air is in different parts of the room. I could sense that. I could have, all kinds of fancy Doppler, sensing technology and, infrared lasers going everywhere. And I could have that sort of brought into my augmented reality glasses. And I could know there's, this sort of plume of hot air rising in this particular place and so on. And once I know that, then, and particularly if I can expect that other people know that as well, we can have a whole conversation about it, which wouldn't have been possible before. And perhaps as we start to have those conversations, we start to want to talk about things scientifically different than we talked about before. I mean, absent a telescope, there are things about what's happening in the heavens that you're just not going to want to discuss. There's nothing to say. You don't know anything about that. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were, well, certainly in terms of sort of human health and so on, there are all kinds of things that one is just about beginning to be able to measure, where one will be able to have discussions about that weren't, it's like, well, that tasted good, but oh yeah, I have this continuous glucose monitor and I could see that it spiked my glucose level at this or that thing. It's a different way of reacting to, the food that you just ate than just the thing of it tasted good type thing. Anyway, a few thoughts about that. Let's see. Well, we should probably wrap up there. Brian is commenting that our notebook assistant really is quite revolutionary, and they look forward to next iterations. Yes, it's an interesting case because we built a notebook assistant to kind of go from vague things one might say to precise computational language, Wolfram language that you can run. And it was completely unclear what it would feel like to have that. And it was completely unclear the extent to which you could take raw, uncarefully thought out thoughts and just sort of type them at the notebook assistant and have it kind of piece together something interesting and useful, or whether that was just going to be a total fail, or whether it would always be saying things that were so sort of obvious that it's like, well, everybody knew that already. It's a thing where knowing what's going to happen, it's not untypical in product development, but this is, I think with AI, it's even more an issue. It's kind of like you can't know what you're going to have until you actually have it. And in this case, it was exciting to me to see that, well, I was starting to use this notebook assistant and I realized I'm using it all the time. It's really useful. It lets me try things it lowers the barrier for trying some new idea and turning it into something computational. And that's I mean, in general, the story of my efforts in using computers and so on has been that question of, can I make the tools good enough that I can just try things on a whim, that I don't have to make a big commitment to, oh, I'm going to try this. It's going to take me a month of programming to be able to do that. No, it's going to take me 15 minutes And even if I didn't know what I was talking about, it's okay to spend that 15 minutes. And I'm going to be able to, and even the process of doing that computational thinking to get it into computational language is going to help me in understanding what I'm talking about. The notebook assistant goes further with that, making it easier to sort of go from, I think, X to computational X was a phrase that I coined on one of these live streams recently, to go from sort of thinking about a thing X to getting to the computational version, to computational X, so to speak. And it's been exciting to me to see that something that I thought was, we knew we were building it as a pragmatic, kind of practical, useful thing, but to see that it actually is something that seems to really make a qualitative difference, really to be something that sort of goes from what one could only imagine to what's actually practically possible. That's an exciting thing. All right, I should go back to my day job, actually to some science for the rest of the day, I think. But thanks for joining me. And as I say, in future live streams, I encourage people to sort of ask questions along the lines of, given this problem, how would you think about this problem? Particularly for sort of general kinds of things in the world. And I'll do my best to answer that. It's a good exercise for me to be sort of challenged to be asked how to think about something. But I hope that perhaps as I try to explain that, if I can succeed in explaining it, that it will be useful to people in sort of the general problem of what is something that, well, I've just spent a lot of time sort of exercising my thinking muscles, so to speak, and perhaps there are some useful things that I can communicate about how one does that. Anyway, thanks for joining me, and see you another time.